The White Guard by Mikhail Bulgakov. Translated by Roger Cockrell. Read by Nicholas Bolton for Naxos Audiobooks. It began to snow, lightly at first, but then in large flakes. The wind started to howl. It was a snowstorm. In an instant, the dark sky merged into an ocean of snow. Everything disappeared. "We're done for now, sir," shouted the coachman. "It's a blizzard." Pushkin, the captain's daughter. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. Book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 12. Part 1. Chapter 1. Great and terrible was the year of our Lord 1918, the second year after the Revolution. The summer was abundant with sun, and the winter with snow, and two stars stood especially high in the sky, the shepherd's star, the evening Venus, and red, quivering Mars. Yet, whether times are peaceful or bloody, the days fly past like arrows, and the young Turbins did not notice the onset of white, hoary December. Oh, Santa Claus, glistening with snow and happiness! Oh, mother of ours, glittering queen, where are you? A year after her daughter Yelena had married Captain Sergei Ivanovich Talberg, and in the very same week in which her elder son Alexei Vassilievich Turbin had returned home to the Ukraine, to the city, after a disastrous period of military service and heavy fighting, that very same week the white coffin containing the body of their mother had been carried down the steep St. Alexei's hill to the little church of St. Nicholas the Good in Podol on the embankment. It was May when they conducted the funeral service for their mother, and the arched windows of the church were overhung with the branches of cherry trees and acacias. Father Alexander, stumbling from grief and strong emotion, sparkled and shone in the golden lights, and the deacon, his face and neck the colour of violet, the forged gold gleaming from his head right down to the soles of his boots, sorrowfully intoned the words of the funeral service for a mother who had left her children behind. Alexei, Yelena, Talberg, Anyuta, who had been brought up as one of the family, and young Nikolka, stunned by the death, with a lock of hair falling over his right eyebrow, stood at the foot of the ancient brown icon of St. Nicholas. Nikolka's light blue eyes, on either side of his long, bird-like nose, wore a lost, shattered expression. From time to time he looked up at the iconostasis, at the arch of the altar, barely perceptible in the semi-gloom, and at the sad, enigmatic figure of an ancient god towering above them and winking. Why had this insult been inflicted upon them? What an injustice! Why had it been necessary to take their mother away from them, just when everyone had come together and started to feel a sense of relief? Flying away into the crack in the dark sky, God said nothing in reply, and Nikolka was as yet unaware that everything that happens, whatever it might be, is always as it should be, and always only for the best. When the service was over, they went out onto the ringing flagstones of the church porch and accompanied their mother the whole way across the huge city to the cemetery, where their father had long since lain under a black marble cross, and there they buried their mother. How many years before their mother's death at number 13 on St. Alexei's Hill had little Yelena, the elder son Alexei, and tiny Nikolka been warmed and nurtured by the tiled stove in the dining room? How often had they sat by its glowing tiles, reading The Shipwright of Sardam, with the clock playing its gavotte? At the end of every December, the air had been filled with the scent of pine needles, the multicoloured paraffin candles glowing on the green branches. The black clock on the dining room wall had chimed in response to the gavotte played by the bronze clock standing in their mother's, now Yelena's, bedroom. Their father had bought these clocks long ago, when women still wore comical sleeves puffed up to the shoulders. These sleeves had disappeared. Time had sped by. Their professor father had died. Everyone had grown up. But the clocks remained, continuing to chime just as they had always done. These clocks had become so familiar that if by some strange chance they had vanished from the walls, everybody would have been affected as much as if a familiar voice had died, creating a gap that nothing could fill. But clocks, fortunately, live forever, just as the shipwright of Sardam lives forever, and, like some wise ancient rock, the tiled Dutch stove continued, even in the most difficult times, to radiate warmth and life. And these tiles, together with the old red velvet furniture, the beds with their shiny brass knobs, the worn rugs, some multicoloured, some red, depicting Alexei Mikhailovich with a falcon perched on his arm, the portrait of Louis XIV reclining languorously on the shores of a silken lake in some heavenly garden, the Turkish carpets with their stunning oriental curlicues that entered the young Nikolka's delirious dreams when in bed with scarlet fever, the bronze lamp and lampshade, the finest bookshelves in the world, smelling mysteriously of old chocolate, with Natasha Rostova and the captain's daughter, the gilt cups, the silver, the portraits and the drapes, all 7 dusty, cluttered rooms that had nurtured the young Turbins. All this the children had inherited from their mother at the most difficult of times. With her final breaths, she had clutched at the weeping Yelena's hand and enjoined them all to live together in friendship. But exactly how were they to live? How? The elder brother, the young Dr. Alexei Vasilievich Turbin, was 28, Yelena 24, her husband Captain Talberg 31, and Nikolka 17.5. Their lives seemed to have been shattered just as dawn was breaking. The winds had long since started to blow from the north, to blow and blow without ceasing, and the more they blew, the worse it all became. The oldest Turbin had returned to his native city after the first gusts had blasted the hills above the river Dnieper. Now, at last, one might have thought, it would all stop, and the way of life depicted in those books smelling of chocolate would begin. But instead, it simply grew more and more terrible. The blizzard in the north howled and howled, while, close at hand, they could hear the dull rumbling of thunder and an anguished growling from the depths of the earth. As the year 1918 flew towards its end, life became more threatening and bristling with the passing of each day. The walls would fall, the frightened falcon would fly from the Tsar's white sleeve, the light in the bronze lamp would fade, and the captain's daughter would be burnt in the stove. And although the mother had told her children to live, the time would surely come when they would suffer and die. One day, at dusk, shortly after their mother's funeral, Alexei Turbin went to Father Alexander and said, "We're all feeling so sad, Father Alexander. It's hard for us to forget about our mother, especially when times are so difficult. After all, I've only just got back from the fighting, and I thought we could put everything right. And now this." He fell silent. Sitting at the table in the twilight, he looked pensively into the distance. The priest's little house was overhung with branches from the trees in the church courtyard, so that the walls of the cramped, book-lined study seemed to mark the edge of a mysterious, tangled spring forest. Filled with the scent of lilac, the evening air hummed with the muffled sound of the city. "What can you do?" the priest muttered a couple of times. He was always embarrassed whenever he had to talk to anyone. "It's the will of God." "Do you think that perhaps all this will come to an end? That maybe things will be better in the future?" Turbin asked, addressing no one in particular. The priest shifted uneasily in his chair. "Times are unquestionably hard," he muttered, "but you must not be downhearted." Then, suddenly, freeing his pale white hand from the dark sleeve of his cassock, he placed it on a pile of books and opened the top book at the page in which there was already a coloured, embroidered bookmark. "Despair must not be permitted," he said, still sounding embarrassed, but now with a note of conviction in his voice. "It is a great sin. Even though there will be trials and tribulations to come, I think. Yes, major trials and tribulations," he said, speaking in an even more assured tone. "Lately, you know, I have been sitting at my books, mostly theological, of course." Raising the book a little to allow the last rays of light from the window to fall upon the page, he started to read. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. Chapter 2. And so the frosty white December raced towards its halfway point. There was already a feeling of Christmas in the snowy streets. 1918 would soon be at an end. The Turbins' apartment was situated on the first floor of number 13, overlooking the street. Number 13 was a two-story house of strikingly unusual design, with the ground floor adjoining a sloping and compact little courtyard. Above the house was a garden clinging to an extremely steep hillside, the drooping branches of the trees reaching almost down to the ground. The hill and the little outbuildings were covered in snow, turning them into one gigantic sugarloaf. The house itself was topped by a covering of snow resembling a white general's fur cap. At the front, the lower floor looked out onto the street, whereas at the back it formed a basement abutting the courtyard, beneath the Turbins' veranda. Here the cowardly engineer and unpleasant bourgeois Vasily Ivanovich Lisovich had just lit his feeble yellow lights. Upstairs, by contrast, the Turbins' windows were cheerfully ablaze with lights. At dusk, Alexei and Nikolka went out to the shed to fetch some logs. "Oh, look at that! Practically all gone, damn it! They've been at them once again." By the blue cone of light from Nikolka's torch, they could see that some planks on the shed wall had been ripped away and hastily replaced from the outside. "By God, they should be shot, the devils! Tell you what, why don't we keep watch tonight? I know who it is. It's those shoemakers in number 11. They've got more logs than we have, damn them!" "Oh, to hell with them. Come on, let's go." The rusty lock squeaked, and a pile of logs crashed down. The two of them carried the logs into the house, and by 9 o'clock that evening, the tiles of the Dutch stove had become too hot to touch. The gleaming exterior of this extraordinary stove bore the following historical notes and sketches, the work of Nikolka's hand, done in black ink at various times during 1918, and full of the most profound meaning and significance. "If anyone tells you that the Allies are hurrying to our rescue, don't believe them. The Allies are bastards. He's a Bolshevik sympathizer." A sketch of Momus's face, signed Lancer Leonid Yuryevich. "There's terrible news, so they say. The Red Hordes are on the way." The painted sketch of a head with a drooping moustache and wearing a fur cap with a blue tassel, with the inscription, "Thrash Petlura," and the following notes in paints, Indian ink, ordinary ink, and cherry juice by Yelena and the Turbins' oldest and dearest childhood friends, Mishlaevsky, Karas, and Chervinsky. "Yelena Vasilievna loves us all so, but to some she'll say yes, to others no. Lenochka, I have a ticket for Aida, seat 8, dress circle, right-hand side. Noon, 12th of May, 1918. Have fallen in love. You're fat and ugly. After saying this, I shall shoot myself," accompanied by a very lifelike sketch of a Browning automatic pistol. "Long live Russia! Long live autocracy!" June, a barcarolle. "The whole of Russia remembers the day of Borodino." Then, in Nikolka's hand, in capital letters, "I hereby decree that any comrade responsible for writing unauthorized material on this stove shall be liable to be shot with deprivation of all rights. Signed, Commissar, Podol District Committee, Ladies, Gentlemen's and Women's Tailor, Abram Pruzhina, 30th of January, 1918. The stove's decorated tiles glowed with heat, and just as 30 years ago, the black clock ticked on. Tonk, tank. The older Turbin brother, clean-shaven, fair-haired, having noticeably aged and become sunk in gloom ever since the 25th of October 1917, was sitting in his favourite pose with his legs on the armchair. He was wearing an army jacket with huge pockets, blue riding breeches and soft new shoes. Nikolka was sitting by his brother's feet on a little stool, his forelock flopping over his eyes, his legs stretched out towards the sideboard. It was not a large dining room. He was wearing buckled boots, and he was strumming gently on his beloved guitar. Twang, twang. A little absent-mindedly, however, since everything seemed uncertain at the moment. Things were bad in the city. Anxiety and confusion were everywhere. Nikolka was wearing the epaulets with white stripes of a junior officer. On his left sleeve there was an acute-angled tricolour chevron. Infantry, 1st Detachment, 3rd Squad, formed 4 days ago in anticipation of impending events. And yet, despite these events, everything in the dining room, it has to be said, was wonderful. Warm, cosy, the cream-coloured curtains drawn, and the brothers wrapped in languorous warmth. Alexei dropped his book and stretched himself. "Come on, then. Play us On the March." Twang-ta-tum, twang-ta-tum. Their boots and caps so smart, the young engineers look the part as they march along. Alexei joined in the singing. There was a spark in his eyes, as well as sadness, and his blood quickened with life. But softly, gentlemen, softly. Hello there, summer residents. Hello there, all you folk. The guitar began accompanying the engineers as they marched along. Left, right, left, right. Nikolka's eyes were full of memories of the military school, with its cannon and its peeling classical columns. The cadets crawling on their stomachs from window to window, returning fire. The machine guns in the windows. The school had been surrounded by a large group of soldiers, a whole crowd of them. What could they do now? But General Bogoroditsky had taken fright and surrendered, given himself up with all his cadets. What a disgrace. Hello there, summer residents. Hello there, all you folk. The survey lads are here. Nikolka's eyes clouded over, the columns of heat rising over the red Ukrainian fields, the companies of cadets marching along, covered in dust. At one time it had all been so real, but now it had all gone. The nonsensical disgrace of it all. Yelena pulled back the heavy drapes over the doorway, and her auburn golden hair was silhouetted against the dark gap. She looked tenderly at her brothers, and then cast a very worried look at the clock. It wasn't hard to understand why. Where on earth had Talberg got to? She was anxious. She wanted to hide this by joining in the singing with her brothers. But suddenly she stopped and raised a finger. "Wait! Did you hear that?" All 7 strings of the guitar and the engineer's march came to an abrupt halt. The 3 of them listened intently. It was gunfire. Distant and muffled, but clearly heavy gunfire. Boom! There it was again. Nikolka quickly put down his guitar and stood up, followed with a grunt by Alexei. The sitting room was totally dark. Nikolka bumped into a chair. Outside, with all the snow, noise, and twinkling lights, it looked like a scene from the opera Christmas Eve. Nikolka pressed his face to the window. The heat and the training school had disappeared from his eyes, to be replaced by an expression of intense alertness. Where was the gunfire coming from? He shrugged his junior officer's shoulders. God only knows. Could be coming from somewhere near Sviatoshin. It's strange, though. Shouldn't be that close. Alexei stayed back in the darkness, but Yelena was closer to the window, her frightened black-rimmed eyes clearly reflecting her anxiety. Why hadn't Talberg come? What did that mean? Sensing her agitation, Alexei remained silent, although he very much wanted to say something. Yes, Sviatoshin. There wasn't any doubt about it. That meant the firing was coming from only 8 miles or so away. What was going on? Nikolka gripped the window latch with one hand and pressed on the glass with the other, as if he wanted to push it and climb out. His nose was flattened against the pane. I want to go and find out what's happening. Yes, you go ahead. You're all they need right now. That was Yelena, motivated by anxiety. This was a disaster. Her husband should have been back by no later than 3 that afternoon, for heaven's sake, and it was now 10. They went back into the dining room in silence. The guitar, too, was now glumly silent. Nikolka brought the samovar from the kitchen, and it began to sing and splutter. On the table there were teacups, decorated with delicate flowers on the outside, but with special little gold figures on the inside. During their mother's, Anna Vladimirovna's time, this tea service had been reserved for special family occasions. But now her children used it every day. Despite the gunfire and all the anxiety, alarm and nonsense going on, the tablecloth was white and starched. This was thanks to Yelena, who could not have done otherwise, and also to Anyuta, who had grown up in the Turbin household. The floors were gleaming, and even though it was December, there were a few blue hydrangeas and 2 rather sorry-looking sultry roses in a tall mat vase on the table, asserting life's beauty and permanence, despite the fact that at the gates to the city there was a cunning enemy, capable perhaps of destroying its snow-covered beauty and trampling on the rubble. The flowers had been brought by Yelena's faithful admirer, Guards Lieutenant Leonid Yuryevich Chervinsky, the friend of the saleslady in La Marquise, the famous confectionery shop, as well as of the saleslady in the snug little flower shop, Les Fleurs de Nice. Beneath the hydrangeas there was a blue-patterned plate, some slices of sausage, some butter in a glass dish, sugar lumps in a bowl, and a long white loaf. If only things weren't so awful outside, how wonderful it would have been just to enjoy it all. Goodness, how wonderful. There was a brightly coloured tea cosy in the shape of a cockerel covering the teapot, and the distorted reflections of the 3 Turbin faces could be seen in the gleaming side of the samovar, with Nikolka's cheeks resembling those of Momus. Yelena's eyes had an anguished expression, and locks of hair touched with gold drooped mournfully down. The evening had been ruined. Talberg and his train, with its consignment of the hetman's money, must have got stuck somewhere. What could have happened to him, damn it? The brothers listlessly ate their bread and sausage. In front of Yelena lay her cup of cold tea and a copy of The Gentleman from San Francisco. Her eyes, misted over and unseeing, were fixed on the words gloom, ocean, storm. But Yelena was not reading. Finally, Nikolka could hold out no longer. "I'd really like to know why the firing is so close. It can't be that close, surely." He interrupted himself, his reflection in the samovar being distorted as he moved. Pause. The hand on the clock crawled on past 10 and, tonk, tank, on towards 1/4 past. "They're shooting because the Germans are bastards," Alexei blurted out unexpectedly. Yelena looked up at the clock. "But surely they wouldn't just leave us to our fate, would they?" she asked dejectedly. As if by command, the brothers looked the other way, and started lying to her. "Nothing is certain," Nikolka said, chewing at a piece of bread. "I was talking hypothetically. It's just rumours." "No, it's not just rumours," Yelena replied stubbornly. "It's a fact, not a rumour. I saw Mrs. Cheglova today, and she said that 2 German regiments had withdrawn from Borodyanka." "Nonsense." "Think about it," said Alexei. "Would it make any sense for the Germans to allow that sly devil to come anywhere near the city? Think about it. I cannot begin to imagine how they could coexist even for a single minute. A totally absurd idea. The Germans and Petliura. They themselves call him nothing but a bandit. Just a laughable idea." "What are you on about? I've got to know the Germans now. I've seen some of them myself, in red armbands, and I saw a drunk warrant officer with some woman or other. The woman was drunk as well." "So what? You'll get individual cases of misbehaviour just like that, even in the German army." "And so, Petliura won't enter the city, in your opinion?" "In my opinion, that will never happen." "Absolument. Pour me another cup of tea, please. Stop worrying. Remain, as they say, calm." "But where is Sergei, for goodness sake? I'm sure his train has been attacked and—" "Stop it at once. That line he's on is completely clear. I know it is." "Well, why isn't he here, then?" "Good God, you know yourself what travel is like. I bet they've had a 4-hour delay at every station." "That's revolutionary travel for you. 1 hour on the move, 2 at a standstill." Sighing deeply, Yelena glanced up at the clock. "But good heavens," she continued after a pause, "if the Germans hadn't behaved so abominably, everything would have been fine. You only needed 2 of their regiments, and this Petliura of yours would have been crushed like a fly. No, the Germans are clearly playing some despicable double game. And what about the wonderful Allies? Where are they, the scum? They promised and promised." The samovar, silent up to this point, suddenly started to sing, and a few coals covered in grey ash tumbled out onto the tray. Involuntarily, the brothers glanced at the stove. That was its answer, perhaps. The Allies are swine. The hand of the clock reached 1/4 past. With a distinct wheeze, the clock struck once, to be answered immediately by the quiet, high-pitched ring of the doorbell on the hall ceiling. "Thank God! That must be Sergei," Alexei said joyfully. "Yes, it's Talberg," agreed Nikolka, who ran to open the door. Yelena stood up, her face flushed. But it wasn't Talberg at all. 3 doors slammed shut, and Nikolka's astonished voice could be heard indistinctly on the staircase. Then someone's reply, followed by the clatter of hobnailed boots and a rifle butt on the floor. The door into the hallway let in a draught of cold air, and in front of Alexei and Yelena stood a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a full-length army coat with khaki epaulets, with the 3 stars of a lieutenant drawn in indelible pencil. The coat hood was covered in hoarfrost, and the heavy rifle and brown bayonet filled the whole hallway. "Hello!" piped the figure in a hoarse tenor voice as he clutched at his hood with numb fingers. "Vitya!" Nikolka helped the figure untie the ends of the drawstring, and the hood slipped down to reveal an officer's cap with a faded badge, and then, above the huge shoulders, the head of Lieutenant Viktor Viktorovich Myshlaevsky. It was a very handsome head, strangely sad and beautiful, its attractiveness the result of many centuries of good, if somewhat degenerate, breeding, also reflected in his long eyelashes and the fearless expression in his eyes, each of a different colour. The nose was aquiline, the lips proud, and the forehead white and smooth without any distinguishing marks. But one corner of his mouth drooped sadly, and his chin slanted slightly, as if a sculptor had begun with the intention of carving an aristocratic face, but had then conceived the wild idea of chipping off a chunk of clay to create a small, irregular chin that was more feminine than masculine. "Where have you come from?" "Yes, where have you been?" "Careful," Myshlaevsky answered in a feeble voice. "Don't break the bottle of vodka." Nikolka carefully hung up the heavy coat. The neck of a bottle wrapped in newspaper peeped out from one of its pockets. Then, rocking the antler stand, he hung up the heavy Mauser in its wooden holster. Only then did Myshlaevsky turn to Yelena, kiss her hand, and say, "I've come from the Red Tavern area. Let me stay the night here, Lena. I won't be able to make it home." "My God, of course." Myshlaevsky suddenly gave a groan and tried to blow on his fingers, but his lips wouldn't obey him. His white eyebrows and velvety trimmed moustache, tipped with hoarfrost, had begun to thaw, and his face ran with moisture. Alexei unbuttoned his service jacket, running his hand down the seam of his dirty shirt as he started to pull it away. "I knew it. Crawling with lice." "I know what," Yelena said, suddenly stirring herself, momentarily forgetting about Talberg in her anxiety. "There are some logs in the kitchen, Nikolka. Run and light the boiler. Oh, it's so awful. Why on earth did I have to give Anyuta the evening off? Quick, Alexei, take his jacket off." In the dining room, Myshlaevsky, by now giving full rein to his groans, slumped down on a chair by the stove. Yelena bustled about, her keys jingling. Alexei and Nikolka knelt down and tugged off Myshlaevsky's tight-fitting dapper boots, buckled at the calves. "Hey, gently, gently." Then they unwound his disgusting, filthy leggings to reveal his lilac-coloured silk socks. Nikolka immediately took the jacket out to the cold veranda. The lice can all die out there. Sitting in his dirty linen vest, black braces and blue-striped breeches, looking ill, worn and thin, Myshlaevsky cut a pathetic figure. He clapped his blue hands together and rubbed them along the tiles of the stove. Tear, new, whore, way, love, may. "The bastards!" exclaimed Alexei. "They might at least have given you proper felt boots and warm sheepskin coats." "Felt boots," repeated Myshlaevsky mockingly, the tears in his eyes. "Felt boots." The warmth inside the apartment was inducing unbearable pain in his frozen hands and feet. When Yelena's footsteps in the kitchen were no longer audible, he cried out, angrily and tearfully, "What an utter shambles!" Twisting and turning, breathing hoarsely, he slumped down again and jabbed a finger at his socks. "Take them off! Take them off!" There was a revolting smell of methylated spirits, and a mound of melting snow lay in the basin. With a glass full of vodka inside him, Lieutenant Myshlayevsky had suddenly become inebriated. All sense had gone from his eyes. "I hope to God they won't have to be amputated," he said bitterly, rocking in his chair. "No, they're fine. They'll be all right. The big toe's frostbitten, that's all. It will come back to life, just like everything else." As Myshlayevsky put his stiff wooden arms into the sleeves of a shaggy bathing robe, Nikolka squatted down by his feet and pulled on a pair of clean black socks. Hunched up in clean underwear and bathing robe, the frozen Lieutenant Myshlayevsky returned to the land of the living. Red spots had appeared on his cheeks. Swear words started leaping violently about the room like hail on a windowsill. With unfocused eyes, he began to direct a torrent of obscenities at the general staff in their first-class railway carriages, at a certain Colonel Stetkin, at the frost, Petlura, the Germans, and the blizzard, finishing by referring to the hetman of all Ukraine himself in the basest and foulest terms imaginable. Alexei and Nikolka looked at the lieutenant as he sat there thawing out, grinding his teeth. Every so often they made sympathetic and understanding noises. "The hetman, eh? The motherfucker!" roared Myshlayevsky. "And what about the horse guards? Where were they? In the palace. How about that? But we were sent off to fight as we were. How about that? Whole days and nights out in the snow and the frost. Good God! We thought we wouldn't get through, fuck it! Nothing but a few officers strung out every couple of 100 yards. Do you call that a defensive line? Could have been slaughtered like a lot of chickens." "Wait a moment," Alexei said, reeling from the coarse outburst. "Tell us who it was in the Red Tavern area exactly." "Poof!" Myshlayevsky gestured dismissively. "Absolutely no idea. Do you know how many of us there were there? 40 of us. Then that old witch Colonel Stetkin arrives and says—" At this point, Myshlayevsky screwed up his face and, speaking in a repellently thin lisp, attempted to mimic the hated Colonel Stetkin. "Gentlemen, the entire hope of the city rests on you. Be worthy of the trust of the dying mother of Russian cities, and if the enemy should appear, then attack. God is with us. You will be relieved in 6 hours, but use the ammunition sparingly." "And off he swishes in his car with his adjutant," continued Myshlayevsky, now speaking in his normal voice. "It's dark as an arsehole, and the frost jabs into you like needles." "Yes, but who was it there, for heaven's sake? Petlura can't be anywhere in that area, surely." "Who the devil knows? By next morning, believe me, we've practically gone out of our minds. Ever since midnight, in fact, waiting to be relieved. All feeling in arms and legs has gone, but no sign of any relief. We can't light any fires, of course. There's a village less than a mile away, and the Red Tavern's even closer. During the night you begin to imagine things. The field seems to be moving, could be people crawling. All right, I think. What shall we do? You fling up your rifle, wondering whether to shoot or not. It's very tempting. You stand there and howl like a wolf. You shout, and someone farther along the line answers. In the end, you dig yourself a hole in the snow with your rifle butt, settle down and try to stay awake. Sleep and you're done for. Just before daybreak, I can't hold out any longer. I can feel myself dozing off. What do you think saved me? Machine guns. As the sun comes up, all hell breaks loose, perhaps a couple of miles away. And can you imagine? I don't want to get up. Then a field gun starts blasting away. I stand up. I feel as if I have heavy weights on my legs. That's just brilliant, I think. Petlura's here. Our line closes up a little and we start to call across to each other. We decide that in the event of an attack, we'll close up and form a single group, return fire, and move back in the direction of the city. If they overwhelm us, then they overwhelm us. At least we'd be together. And then, can you imagine? Everything goes quiet. During the morning, groups of 3 of us at a time run to the tavern to thaw out. When do you think our relief arrives? 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's 2 o'clock this afternoon. 200 cadets from the 1st Detachment, all properly equipped as you can imagine, in fur caps, felt boots, and with a machine gun unit, led by Colonel Naitours. "Ah, one of ours!" shouted Nikolka. "Wait a moment. Isn't he with the Belgrade Hussars?" "Yes, that's right. Anyway, when they see us, they're horrified, of course. We thought there were 2 companies with machine guns here, they say. How on earth did you manage to hold out?" It turned out that those machine guns we'd heard at daybreak had been part of a motley group of about 1,000 attacking Serebryanka. Luckily, they didn't know just how thin our line was, otherwise, as you can imagine, the whole lot of them would have been in the city. And lucky, too, that the others just had time to inform Postvolinsky, which meant that some battery or other could shell the enemy. Anyway, they lost the will to carry on the attack and melted away into thin air. God knows where. But who were they? It can't really have been Petlura, can it? Who the hell knows? I think it was local peasants. God-bearers straight out of Dostoevsky. The motherfuckers. Good God. Yes, Mishlaevsky continued hoarsely, drawing on a cigarette. We were relieved, thank the Lord. When we counted up, there were 38 of us. So there you are, you see. Only 2 of us had frozen to death. Finished. But there were 2 others taken away to have their feet amputated. What? 2 of you died? Well, what did you expect? 1 cadet and 1 officer. But things were even more fun in Popolyucha, a village near the Red Tavern where I'd gone with Lieutenant Krasin to get a sledge for those who'd been frostbitten. So here we are in the village, seems absolutely dead, not a soul. We look around and finally spot some old bloke in a sheepskin cloak hobbling along on a crutch. When he sees us, he's really happy. Can you imagine? There's something going on that's not quite right here, I'm thinking. Why is this silly old codger shouting at us so ecstatically? "Hey, lads!" he called out in Ukrainian. So I launch into Ukrainian as well, using my sweetest voice. "Hello, Grandad. We need a sledge, quickly." And he goes and answers, "There ain't no sledges. Them officer lot have taken them all off to Post." So I wink at Krasin and say, "Officer lot, eh? So where's everyone else then?" "Them's run off to join Petlura," he blurted out. How do you like that, eh? The blind old fool hadn't spotted the epaulettes under our hoods and had taken us for Petlura's men. So as you can imagine, I can hold back no longer. I see red, what with the frost and everything. I grab the old boy by the front of his coat and shout at him so loudly he almost dies from fright. "Run off to join Petlura? I'll shoot you on the spot. That will teach you how to run off to Petlura. You'll run off to Kingdom Come, you swine." At this, of course, our saintly son of the soil, a whole avalanche of abuse poured from Mishlaevsky, sees the light in a flash, falls to his knees and starts shouting, "Oh, Your Honour, please forgive me, I was joking. I'm just an old man, can't see very well. I'll get your horses right away, many as you want, only please don't shoot me." So we get our horses and our sledge. Anyway, we get to Postvolinsky by dusk. You simply can't imagine how awful everything is there. On our way there, we come across 4 batteries, but none of them ready for action. No ammo, it seems. Countless staff officers. Nobody knows a thing, of course. But our main problem is to know what to do with the dead bodies. In the end, we come across a mobile first aid unit, but they just dump the bodies on the ground. Would you believe it? Not interested in them. Simply say we should take them to the city. At this, we become really angry. Krasin wants to shoot some staff officer who tells us we're behaving as badly as Petlura's men and then vanishes. It's not until dark that we finally find Shchetkin's railway carriage. First-class carriage, electric light, and what do you think? We're refused entry by some lick-spittle orderly. How about that? He's asleep, he says, and not to be disturbed. Well, I start bashing against the side of the carriage with my rifle butt, and everyone else joins in. People immediately pour out of every compartment, like peas from a pod. Then Shchetkin himself appears. "My God, yes, of course," he says ingratiatingly. "Hey, orderly, soup and cognac for these officers. We'll find you somewhere immediately and you can have a complete rest. You're all heroes. Terrible losses, I know, but what can you do? Sacrifices are necessary. I've been through so much." You could smell the cognac a mile off. Mishlaevsky suddenly yawned, and his head began to nod. Then he started muttering, seemingly in his sleep. "They gave the group a separate carriage with a stove. But I was lucky. He decided to get rid of me after all that racket. I order you, Lieutenant, to go to the city and report to General Kartuthov's headquarters." Got a lift on a locomotive. Freezing. To Mara's castle. vodka. Mishlaevsky's cigarette dropped out of his mouth. He leant back in his chair and immediately started snoring. "Well, that's terrific, isn't it?" said Nikolka, totally confused. "Where's Yelena?" asked Alexei anxiously. "He'll need a sheet. Take him for a wash." All this time, Yelena had been in the room off the kitchen, weeping. A fire of dry-cut birchwood crackled in the boiler behind the gauze curtain next to the zinc bath. The ancient kitchen clock wheezed as it struck 11 o'clock. The image of Talberg, lying dead, came into her head. Obviously, the train carrying the money had been attacked and the escort intercepted. Blood and brains in the snow. She sat there in the semi-gloom, the light from the fire glowing through her tangled hair, the tears pouring down her cheeks. Dead. Dead. Then the doorbell rang. It was very soft, but audible throughout the apartment. Yelena raced through the kitchen, through the darkened library, and into the dining room, where the lights were brighter. The black clock struck the hour, then resumed its slow progress. But the two brothers' outburst of joy faded very quickly. Indeed, any joy was reserved more for Yelena. When they saw the wedge-shaped badges on Talberg's epaulettes, denoting the hetman's war ministry, they reacted very negatively. Ever since the day of Yelena's wedding, in fact, it was as if a crack in the vase of the Turbins' life had formed, and any good water inside had imperceptibly been draining away. The vase was now dry. Perhaps the main reason for this was the double-layered expression in the eyes of Staff Captain Sergei Ivanovich Talberg. Be that as it may, at this moment at least, the upper layer could be read perfectly clearly. The natural, happy expression of someone reacting to light, warmth, and a feeling of security. A little deeper, however, was the sense of plain fear which Talberg had brought with him into the house. But deeper still, of course, everything was hidden from view. In any event, Talberg's figure revealed nothing at all outwardly. His belt was broad and firm. The white surfaces of both his badges, the academy and the university, gleamed equally brightly. His lean, wiry figure moved around above the black clock like an automaton. Although he was frozen to the bone, he smiled at everyone with equal benevolence. But there was anxiety in this smile as well. Nikolka, his long nose twitching, was the first to notice this. In a slow but light-hearted drawl, Talberg described how the train which he had been escorting and which had been carrying money to the provinces had been attacked near Borodyanka, some 25 miles from the city. But nobody knew who the attackers were. Yelena grimaced with horror and clung to him tightly, while the brothers again made soothing noises, and Mishlaevsky lay there snoring the sleep of the dead, revealing the 3 gold crowns in his teeth. "Who could it have been? Petliura's men?" "If it had been Petliura's men," said Talberg in a superior tone but with an anxious smile, "I'd hardly be here now, talking to you. I don't know who it was. A mixed group of Ukrainian nationalists, possibly. They burst into the carriage, waving their rifles around and shouting, 'Whose lot are you?' 'Ukrainians,' I replied. They tramped up and down the carriage. Then I heard the command, 'Everyone off, lads,' and they all disappeared. I suppose they were looking for Russian officers, probably thinking that the escort hadn't been Ukrainians but Russian officers." As he said this, Talberg glanced meaningfully at the stripes on Nikolka's uniform. Then he glanced at the clock and said unexpectedly, "Yelena, I'd just like a word or two." Yelena quickly followed him into the bedroom in the Talbergs' half of the apartment, the room where the falcon sat perched on the Tsar's white sleeve, where the green lamp glowed softly on Yelena's desk, and where the bronze shepherds stood on the mahogany pedestal supporting the clock that played the gavotte every 3 hours. It cost Nikolka a superhuman effort to wake Mishlaevsky. The latter stumbled to the bathroom, clutching at a couple of doors as he crashed into them. Once in the bath, he fell asleep, with Nikolka keeping watch to make sure he didn't drown. In the meantime, Alexei, without knowing exactly why, made his way to the darkened living room, pressed his ears to the window, and listened intently. Once again there was the seemingly inoffensive sound of distant gunfire, muffled as if the guns had been wrapped in cotton wool. Golden-haired Yelena had suddenly aged and become less attractive. Her eyes were red. With her hands hanging at her sides, she was listening sorrowfully to Talberg. Towering above her in his crisp, dry staff uniform, he was saying implacably, "There is no other course of action, Yelena." "All right, I understand," Yelena said, reconciled to the inevitable. "You're right, of course. 5 or 6 days, yes? Maybe the situation will have improved by then, yes?" At this point, Talberg found himself in difficulty. Even his permanent, patented smile disappeared from his face. It, too, had aged. Every line in it demonstrated that his mind was firmly made up. Yelena. Yelena. Oh, her hope was so fragile, so treacherous. 5 or 6 days. "I have to go now. This very minute," he said. "My train leaves at 1 a.m. Half an hour later, everything in the room with the falcon was topsy-turvy. The suitcase lay on the floor, its inner stripy lid wide open. Yelena, looking thin and severe, and with lines at the corners of her mouth, was silently packing his shirts, underwear and sheets. Talberg was kneeling at the bottom drawer of the cupboard, fiddling with the key. And then, however unpleasant a room in which the chaos of packing is taking place, it's always much worse when a shade is removed from a lamp. Never ever remove a shade from a lamp. A shade is sacred. Never scuttle like a rat into the unknown and away from adversity. Sit by the lampshade and doze or read. Let the storm howl outside and wait for people to come to you. But Talberg was indeed scuttling away. He stood up straight, treading on the scraps of paper lying near the heavy suitcase, its lid now closed. He was wearing his long army coat, his neat black cap with earmuffs and blue-grey hetman's badge, and his sword belted to his side. At the long-distance platform of the city's passenger railway station No. 1, the train was already waiting. As yet it had no locomotive, so that it resembled a headless caterpillar. There were 9 carriages, all dazzlingly lit with electric lighting. This was the train that was transporting the headquarters staff of General von Büssow to Germany. They were taking Talberg with them, for Talberg had connections. The hetman's regime was an idiotic and banal comic opera, just like the hetman himself, it had to be said. Talberg was fond of using such direct but trivial expressions. Even more trivial, since "The Germans are abandoning the hetman to his fate, you understand," he whispered to Yelena. "And it's perfectly possible that Petliura will enter the city, and that... you know." Oh yes, Yelena knew all right. She knew perfectly well. In March 1917, Talberg had been the first, you understand, in the military training school to wear a broad red armband on his sleeve. This was in the very early days, a time when all the Russian officers in the city, on hearing the news from St. Petersburg, totally clammed up and went off into a dark corridor, unwilling to listen to anything further. As a member of the Revolutionary Military Committee, it had been none other than Talberg who had arrested the famous General Petrov. When, towards the end of that famous year, the city had witnessed a whole succession of marvellous and strange events, and when people had begun to appear on its streets without boots, but wearing wide baggy trousers under their grey military coats, and when these same people had started to declare that they wouldn't leave the city for the front line under any circumstances, since there was nothing for them to do there, and that they would remain here in the city, Talberg became annoyed, dryly observing that this was just a comic opera, not at all what was needed. And it turned out he was partly right. What had transpired had indeed come to resemble a comic opera, but a far from simple one that entailed considerable bloodshed. In no time at all, the people in baggy trousers had been chased out of the city by various irregular groups of soldiers who had appeared from somewhere out of the forests and from the broad plain leading to Moscow. Talberg said that the people in baggy trousers were merely opportunists. The real roots lay in Moscow, even if these roots might be Bolshevik. One March day, however, columns of Germans dressed in field grey and wearing rusty metal helmets to protect them from shrapnel arrived in the city. They were accompanied by hussars, and when Talberg saw their beautiful fur caps and horses, he immediately understood where the routes actually lay. After a few salvos of heavy gunfire from the German guns on the outskirts of the city, the troops from Moscow vanished somewhere beyond the grey-blue forests to eat carrion, while the people in baggy trousers followed the Germans and shambled back into the city. This was a big surprise. Thalberg smiled in some confusion, but decided there was nothing to be afraid of, since, with the Germans there, the baggy trousers behaved extremely placidly, not daring to kill anybody, and even walking about the streets a little warily, behaving as if they were guests at an event, but not certain they'd been invited. Thalberg said that they lacked proper routes and had not served in any post for a couple of months. One day, however, Nikolka had to smile walking into Thalberg's room. Thalberg was sitting at his desk, writing out grammatical expressions on a piece of paper. A slim volume printed on inexpensive grey paper lay open in front of him. Ignaty Perpillo, Ukrainian Grammar. In the April of 1918, at Easter, the electric arc lights hummed cheerfully, and the circus arena was packed to the top of the dome with people. Thalberg's tall military figure stood in the centre of the arena, counting the votes on a show of hands. This meant the end of the baggy trousers, and the beginning of a Ukraine, not just any Ukraine, but a hetman's Ukraine. They were electing the hetman of all Ukraine. "We are now protected from that bloody comic opera in Moscow," Thalberg said as he stood at home, gleaming in his unfamiliar hetman's uniform, looking incongruous against the background of the familiar old wallpaper. The clock wheezed derisively on, tonk, tank, and the water continued to drain from the vase. Nikolka and Alexei had nothing to say to Thalberg, and indeed it would have been very difficult to say anything, because Thalberg became very angry at any mention of politics, especially whenever Nikolka tactlessly broached the topic of what he, Seryozha, might have said in March. At this, Thalberg would become agitated and bare his unevenly spaced but firm white teeth, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous yellowish glint. As a result, such conversations quickly died a natural death. Yes, a comic opera. Yelena knew what this meant when uttered by puffy Baltic lips. But now the operatic portents no longer boded well, not for the baggy trousers, nor for Moscow, nor for any old Ivan Ivanovitch, but for him personally, for Sergei Ivanovich Thalberg. Everyone has their own star, and it was not for nothing that in the Middle Ages the court astrologers had compiled horoscopes predicting the future. How wise they had been! For Thalberg's star, you see, was extremely unlucky. Had everything proceeded in a single straight line, he would have been all right. But at this moment in time, events in the city were proceeding not in a straight line, but in astonishing zigzags, and Sergei Ivanovitch's attempts to predict the future were unsuccessful and totally fruitless. Still some distance away, perhaps 100 or 120 miles from the city, a brightly lit Pullman railway carriage was waiting in the sidings. A clean-shaven man lolled in the carriage like a pea in a pod, dictating orders to his secretaries and adjutants. Woe to Thalberg should this man enter the city, and he could well do so. Everybody had read the edition of the News featuring the name of Captain Thalberg as someone who had voted for the hetman, as well as the article he had written that said that Petliura was an opportunist who threatened to destroy the region with his comic opera tactics. "Yelena, I can't take you with me. You do understand, don't you? We would just be wandering about in the dark." But Yelena was too proud to say anything. "I'll be able to get to the Don by going through Romania and the Crimea without too much trouble, I should imagine. Von Büssow has promised to help. The Germans think highly of me. The German occupation has become an absurd comic opera, and they're already leaving. And I calculate that Petliura," he continued in a whisper, "cannot last very long either. No, the real force will come from the Don, and you must understand that I simply have to be there when the army representing justice and order is being formed. My career would be in ruins otherwise. You know, don't you, that Denikin was my divisional commander. I'm sure that in 3 months' time, well, by May at the very latest, we'll be entering the city. You have nothing to fear. Nobody will touch you under any circumstances, and in any case, if the worst comes to the worst, You have your passport in your maiden name. I shall ask Alexei to make certain you come to no harm." Yelena suddenly recollected herself. "Wait a moment," she said. "You will warn my brothers at once, won't you, that we are being betrayed by the Germans?" Talberg's face reddened. "Yes, of course. Absolutely. But why don't you tell them yourself? Not that it will change things very much, of course." A strangely disturbing thought flitted through Yelena's mind, but she had no time to express it. Talberg was already kissing his wife. Just for one moment there was a look of tenderness in his double-layered eyes. Yelena could stand it no longer and began to cry, but only very quietly. She was, after all, her mother's daughter, as well as being a remarkably strong woman. Then it was time to say goodbye to the brothers in the living room. The bronze lamp illuminated one corner of the room in a pinkish glow. Above the piano's familiar white keys, the score of Faust lay open at the page of the densely black rippling passage where the ginger-bearded and magnificently costumed Valentin sings, "Please, I beg you for my sister's sake, have pity and take care of her." And even Talberg, never one to indulge in any sentimental feelings, remembered the dark modulations and tattered pages of the immortal Faust once more. Goodness! Never again will Talberg hear the aria, "O Almighty God," or listen to Yelena accompanying Stravinsky. And yet, long after the Turbins and Talberg have departed this earth, pianos will be played, the magnificently costumed Valentin will come onto the stage, the scent of perfume will be redolent in the theatre boxes, and in domestic living rooms, women bathed in lamplight will play the accompaniment. For Faust, just like the shipwright of Sardam, will never die. Talberg said all that he had to say, standing by the piano. Out of politeness, the brothers remained silent, trying not to raise their eyebrows. The younger, out of pride, the elder because he considered Talberg to be worthless. Talberg's voice trembled. "Be sure to look after Yelena," he said, an anxious and pleading expression reflected in the upper layer of his eyes. Lost for words and not sure what to do, he glanced at his watch. "Time to go," he said anxiously. Yelena embraced her husband, made a hasty sign of the cross over him, and kissed him. Talberg pricked the faces of his brothers-in-law with the bristles of his black-clipped moustache. He anxiously checked the documents in his wallet, counting a thin bundle of Ukrainian notes and German marks. Then, smiling tensely, he turned and left the room. There was the sound of footsteps on the floor, the light spluttered on in the hallway, then the rumble of a suitcase on the stairs. Leaning over the banisters, Yelena saw the sharp peak of his hood for the final time. At 1 a.m., an armoured train resembling some grey toad rumbled out of a darkened track 5 and into the graveyard of empty goods wagons. Hooting like a wild beast and spitting hot sparks from its furnace, it quickly picked up speed. Within 7 minutes, it had covered the 5 miles or so to Postvolinsky. Without slowing down, and with its lights flashing, it rattled and crashed across the points and away from the main line, instilling in the hearts of the frozen cadets and officers huddled together in their carriages and trenches at Postvolinsky a vague feeling of hope and a sense of pride. Totally unafraid of anything or anybody, the train boldly curved away in the direction of the German frontier. It was followed 10 minutes later by a passenger train with scores of brightly lit windows and pulled by an enormous locomotive. Solid-looking, massive German sentries, wrapped to the eyes against the cold and standing on the platforms at the end of each carriage, flashed past, their broad black bayonets glinting in the light. The signalmen, their faces fitfully illuminated by the lights from the windows, watched as the long Pullman carriages clattered across the points. The train disappeared, leaving the cadets' hearts filled with envy, anger, and alarm. "The bastards!" someone shouted as the carriage was buffeted by a gust of driving snow. That night was a particularly stormy one for Postvolinsky. Talberg was sitting opposite a German lieutenant in the third carriage from the front, in a compartment furnished with striped covers. He was speaking German with a polite and ingratiating smile on his face. "Oh, yeah," drawled the fat lieutenant from time to time, chewing on a cigar. The lieutenant fell asleep. With the compartment doors closed, the warm, dazzlingly lit carriage was filled with a monotonous hum of casual conversation. Talberg went out into the corridor, where he pulled up the light-coloured blind bearing the transparent letters SWR, and stood for a long time staring out into the gloom. Sparks and snowflakes danced around in the air, while the locomotive up front emitted such threatening, unpleasant howls that even Talberg felt a sense of unease. Chapter 3. At this very same hour, in the downstairs apartment belonging to the owner of the house, the engineer Vasily Ivanovich Lisovich, there was total silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a mouse in the small dining room. The mouse was busily and doggedly gnawing away at a piece of old cheese in the sideboard, cursing the miserliness of the engineer's wife, Vanda Mikhailovna. The object of the mouse's curse, the bony and jealous Vanda, was fast asleep in the dark bedroom of the damp, cool apartment. The engineer himself was awake in his cramped little study, hung with curtains and stuffed with books, which gave the room a remarkably cosy feel. A standard lamp in the form of an Egyptian princess, topped by a green, florid, umbrella-shaped lampshade, filled the entire room with a soft, mysterious light, a mysteriousness that was shared by the engineer himself, sitting in his deep leather armchair. The mystery and ambiguity of the uncertain times in which they lived was above all reflected in the fact that the person in the armchair wasn't Vasily Ivanovich Lisovich at all, but simply Vasilisa. He called himself Lisovich, it is true, and many of those he came across called him Vasily Ivanovich, but this was only to his face. Behind his back, everyone just referred to him as Vasilisa. The reason for this was that ever since the beginning of the truly unusual events in the city in January 1918, he had become afraid that he might be held responsible for something or other in the future. Instead, therefore, of neatly appending his usual name of V. Lisovich on questionnaires, forms, certificates, orders, and ration cards, he had started writing Vas Lis. On the 18th of January 1918, Nikolka had been queuing for sugar on the Khreshchatyk with a ration card given to him by Vasily Ivanovich, when, instead of getting any sugar, he had been struck with terrible force in the back by a stone, and had spent the next 2 days spitting blood. A shell had burst right over the heads of the people who had been bravely standing in the sugar queue. Back home, although green in the face and clutching at the wall, he even managed a smile so as not to alarm Yelena. But when he spat up a whole basinful of blood, she cried out in horror, "My God, what's happened?" "It's all Vasilisa's fault, damn him and his sugar," Nikolka replied. Then he turned white and collapsed onto his side. He was on his feet again within 2 days, but by this time Vasily Ivanovich Lisovich was no more. At first it was only his immediate neighbours, but later the whole city began to refer to the engineer as Vasilisa, with the exception of his wife, who continued to introduce him as chairman of the housing committee, Lisovich. Once he was sure that it had become totally quiet outside, with not even the occasional swish of a sledge going by, and that, from the whistling sound coming from the bedroom, his wife was still soundly asleep, Vasilisa went out to the hallway and carefully checked that the bolts, lock, latch, and chain were secure, and then returned to his little study. He took out 4 safety pins from the drawer of his massive desk, placing them on top. Then he tiptoed somewhere into the darkness and returned carrying a sheet and a rug. Once again he stood for a moment, listening carefully, and even put his finger to his lips. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and reached up to the shelf for a pot of glue, a neat roll of wallpaper, and a pair of scissors. Then he pressed his face close to the window and, shielding his face with the palm of his hand, looked out onto the street. He hung up the sheet over the bottom half of the window on the left-hand side, then attached the rug to the other window with the safety pins. He carefully arranged the sheet and the rug so that no chinks were visible. Then he climbed on a chair, and groping around for something above the topmost bookshelf, He took a knife and made a vertical cut in the wallpaper, followed by another at right angles to the first. Inserting the knife under the slit, he uncovered a neat little hidey hole, 2 bricks wide, which he himself had made the previous evening. He removed the thin zinc cover and placed it to one side. He then got down from the chair, glanced apprehensively at the windows, and checked the sheet once more. With 2 jingling turns of the key, he then opened the lower drawer of his desk to reveal to God's world at the very bottom of the drawer a sealed packet covered in newspaper, neatly tied both ways. He buried the packet in the hidey hole and replaced the cover. He then spent a long time measuring and cutting out strips of wallpaper on the red tablecloth until he was certain they were the right size. He glued the strips over the slit so expertly and managed to match the little squares and flower patterns so precisely that he was delighted with the result. When the engineer finally got down from the chair, he was satisfied that the hidey hole was completely invisible. He rubbed his hands in glee, scrunched up the wallpaper cuttings, and burned them in the stove. Then he stirred the ashes and hid the glue. Outside, in the dark and empty street, a grey, unkempt, lupine figure climbed silently down from the acacia branch on which he had been sitting for the last 30 minutes. Although frozen to the bone, he had eagerly been observing all that the engineer had been doing through a giveaway gap at the very top of the sheet. It had been the contrast between the white sheet and the green-painted window frame that had first fatally attracted the stranger's attention. Springing lightly down into a snowdrift, he went on up the street and then continued making his way down alleyways, all traces of him being swallowed up and obliterated by the blizzard, the dark, and the snow. Night time. Vasilisa, in his armchair under the green lampshade, looking the very image of Taras Bulba. Drooping, bushy moustache. By God, this isn't Vasilisa, but a real man. There's another gentle jingle of keys in the drawer, and a wad of oblong notes designed like green playing cards appears on the red tablecloth in front of him. The notes bear the following legend, in Ukrainian. State Bank Certificate, 50 karbovancy, parity with all credit notes. The front of the notes depicted a peasant with a drooping moustache, armed with a spade, together with a peasant woman carrying a sickle. The reverse side featured the same couple, their reddish faces magnified within an oval frame, the man sporting the same drooping moustache in the Ukrainian style. The top of the note carried the warning, "The penalty for forgery is imprisonment." Signed Lyebid Yurchik, director of the State Bank. A bronze Alexander II on horseback, sporting a ragged metal foam of side whiskers on either side of his face, looked irritably down at Lyebid Yurchik's work of art and, more indulgently, at the Egyptian princess on her lamp. On the wall, an official with the Order of St. Stanislav round his neck, an oil painting of one of Vasilisa's ancestors, stared in horror at the notes. The spines of books by Goncharov and Dostoevsky glowed softly in the green lamplight, and the gold and black row of Brockhaus and Ephron stood to attention like guards on parade. Domestic bliss. Safely tucked away in the cash in the wall were 5% bonds, together with 1,500 roubles from the time of Catherine the Great, 900 Peter the Great roubles, 1,000 Nicholas I roubles, 3 diamond rings, 1 brooch, 1 Order of Anna, and 2 Orders of St. Stanislav. In cash number 2 were another 2,000 Catherine roubles, another 1,000 Peter roubles, 25 silver spoons, a gold watch and chain, 3 cigarette cases, inscribed to our dear colleague, although Vasilisa was a non-smoker, 50 10-rouble gold coins, salt cellars, a canteen of silver cutlery for 6 people, and a silver tea strainer. This large cash was to be found in the woodshed. From the doorway, take 2 steps forward, 1 to the left, and then 1 more step from the chalk mark on a plank in the wall. Everything was in Einem biscuit boxes, wrapped in oilcloth with tarred seams and buried to a depth of nearly 5 feet. There was a third cache to be found in the attic, hidden in clay under a beam and reached by taking 2 quarter steps in a northeasterly direction from the chimney stack. Here there were the sugar tongs, another 183 10-rouble gold coins, and bonds to the value of 25,000 roubles. The Lyebed Yurchik was for current expenses. Vasilisa glanced round as he always did when counting money, licked his finger, and started to check the Ukrainian notes. He had an inspired expression on his face. Then he suddenly went pale. "That one's a forgery, and so's this," he growled angrily, shaking his head. "This is a disaster." Vasilisa's blue eyes darkened murderously. One of the notes in the third batch of 10 was forged, 2 more in the 4th and 6th batches, and in the 9th batch there were 3 notes in a row, for which Lyebed Yurchik would indubitably threaten imprisonment. Out of a total of 130 notes, 8, if you please, looked clearly to be forgeries. The peasant had a sullen expression when he should have been looking jolly. The hidden quotation marks and colon next to the sheaf were missing, and the paper was of a better quality than Lyebed's. When Vasilisa held one note up to the light, the watermark of Lyebed's portrait clearly showed through on the wrong side. "Right, one of these will be for the cabbie tomorrow evening," he said to himself. "I'll have to take a cab anyway, and then there's also the market." Carefully setting the forged notes intended for the cabbie and the market to one side, he locked the bundle of money away with a jingle of keys. He jumped as the deathly silence was broken by the sound of someone running in the room above, and he could hear laughter and muffled voices. "There you are, you see," he said, addressing Alexander II. "Never any peace." Everything went quiet again. Vasilisa yawned, stroked his bristly moustache, took the sheet and the rug down from the window, and switched on the small lamp in the sitting-room. There was a faint gleam of light from the gramophone loudspeaker. 10 minutes later, and the apartment was completely dark. Vasilisa was asleep next to his wife in the damp bedroom. There was a smell of mice, mould, and querulous boredom. And Vasilisa dreamt that Lyebed Yurchik arrived at the house on horseback, accompanied by thieves who opened up the cache with screwdrivers. Then the Knave of Hearts climbed up on the chair, spat at his moustache, and shot at him point-blank. Vasilisa leapt up with a yell, bathed in cold sweat. The first thing he heard was the family of mice in the dining-room, gnawing away at a bag of biscuits. Then the sound of laughter, and the strumming of a guitar that was being played with unusual tenderness, coming through the ceiling and the carpeted room above. Then, in the room above, a voice started singing with extraordinary power and passion, and the guitar struck up a march. "There's nothing for it. I'll have to kick them out," said Vasilisa, tossing and turning in bed. "This is torture. No peace day or night." The cadets are singing as they march along, with their arms a-swinging as they march along. And yet, maybe, just in case, after all, these are terrible times, and you never know who you might have in their place, as officers they would be some sort of protection if anything happened. "Scram!" he shouted at the enraged mouse, and the guitar played on and on.